Marcus Thompson stepped off the tour bus at Buckingham Palace with the confidence of someone who believed the world revolved around his American passport. At 35, he was a successful tech entrepreneur from Silicon Valley, used to getting his way through a combination of money, charm, and an unshakable belief in his own superiority. His expensive designer clothes, perfectly styled hair, and the latest smartphone in his manicured hands all screamed wealth and privilege. But it was his attitude that truly set him apart from the other tourists gathering around the famous gates of the British royal residence. The London weather was typically unpredictable that Tuesday morning in late September. Gray clouds hung low over the city, threatening rain but never quite delivering on their promise. Marcus had been in England for 3 days as part of what he called his European Conquest Tour, a month-long vacation designed to show him all the places he considered beneath his California standards. So far, he had found plenty to criticize. The food was bland, the weather was depressing, the cars were too small, and the people were far too polite for his liking. Standing before the imposing black and gold gates of Buckingham Palace, Marcus pulled out his phone and began taking selfies. He made sure to capture his bored expression in each shot, planning to post them on social media with captions about how underwhelming European attractions were compared to American landmarks. Around him, other tourists were genuinely excited, pointing at the palace windows and hoping to catch a glimpse of royalty. Children pressed their faces against the railings while parents read guidebooks aloud, sharing historical facts with enthusiasm. The contrast between Marcus and the other visitors was striking. While families from around the world stood in respectful awe of the centuries-old building and its significance, Marcus treated the entire experience like an inconvenience he was obligated to endure. He checked his watch repeatedly, tapped his foot impatiently, and made loud comments about how long the tour was taking and how much better the White House looked in comparison. "This is it," he said loudly to his girlfriend Sarah, who had accompanied him on the trip. "This is what all the fuss is about. I've seen bigger houses in Beverly Hills." Sarah, who worked as a marketing executive back in Los Angeles, had grown increasingly embarrassed by Marcus's behavior throughout their European vacation. She tried to shush him, but Marcus was just getting started. The crowd began to stir with excitement as the time for the changing of the guard ceremony approached. Tourists positioned themselves for the best views, cameras, and phones ready to capture the iconic British tradition. The ceremony, which had been taking place for centuries, represented everything that was steeped in British history and culture. It was a moment that millions of people from around the world traveled thousands of miles to witness. Marcus, however, saw it differently. To him, it was just another overhyped tourist trap designed to separate gullible people from their money. He had already decided that the entire ceremony would be a waste of his valuable time, and he made sure everyone within earshot knew his opinion. His voice carried easily over the excited chatter of the crowd, drawing annoyed looks from other tourists who were trying to enjoy the experience. "I don't understand why people get so excited about watching a bunch of guys in funny hats walk around," Marcus announced loudly. "It's 2023, not the Middle Ages. This whole royal thing is completely outdated." Several British tourists nearby turned to stare at him with obvious disapproval, but Marcus either didn't notice or didn't care about their reactions. Sarah tugged at his sleeve, trying to get him to lower his voice. She had been dating Marcus for 8 months and was beginning to realize that his confidence often crossed the line into arrogance, especially when they were traveling. At home in California, surrounded by people who shared his background and outlook, Marcus's behavior seemed less jarring. But here, in a foreign country with different customs and traditions, his attitude stood out like a neon sign. "Marcus, please," she whispered. "People are staring." But her boyfriend was too caught up in his own performance to pay attention to her discomfort or the growing irritation of the people around them. The sound of military drums began to echo across the palace courtyard, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. The crowd grew quiet with anticipation, phones and cameras raised and ready. Even the most cynical tourists seemed to sense that they were about to witness something special, something that connected them to hundreds of years of British history and tradition. Marcus, however, used the moment of relative quiet to make another loud observation. "I bet this whole thing is just for show anyway," he declared. "Probably half of these guards aren't even real soldiers. They're probably just actors hired to entertain the tourists." His voice carried clearly in the hushed atmosphere, earning him sharp looks from elderly British couples who had been looking forward to the ceremony for months. The first group of guards appeared in the distance, their red uniforms and black bearskin hats instantly recognizable even from far away. The tourists pressed forward slightly, trying to get better views while remaining behind the designated barriers. The precision and discipline of the guards was immediately apparent as they marched in perfect formation, their movements synchronized after countless hours of practice and drill. For most of the observers, watching the guards approach was a moment of genuine excitement and respect. These men represented a tradition that stretched back through centuries of British history, through wars and peace, through the reigns of multiple monarchs. Their uniforms were the same style worn by guards who had protected British royalty through 2 world wars, countless political crises, and decades of social change. Marcus saw none of this history or significance. To him, the approaching guards were simply costumed performers putting on a show for gullible tourists. He had already decided that the entire ceremony was beneath his sophisticated American sensibilities, and he was determined to make sure everyone around him knew exactly what he thought about it. "Look at those ridiculous outfits," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "Those hats must weigh 50 pounds each. How do they even see where they're going?" He paused for effect, looking around to see if his commentary was getting the reaction he wanted. When he noticed that several people were now openly staring at him with disapproval, he seemed to take it as encouragement to continue. "And why are they walking so slowly?" Marcus added, "Is this supposed to be impressive? I could train my gardener to march around in a funny hat if that's all it takes." Sarah closed her eyes in embarrassment, wishing she could disappear into the crowd. She had tried to research British customs before their trip, hoping to help Marcus avoid exactly this kind of cultural insensitivity, but he had dismissed her efforts as unnecessary. The guards continued their approach, their faces stern and professional despite the growing murmur of conversation from the crowd. These men were highly trained soldiers, selected not just for their military skills, but for their ability to maintain composure and dignity in front of crowds of tourists who often treated them more like attractions than like human beings. Marcus, emboldened by what he perceived as a captive audience, decided to escalate his running commentary. He began mimicking what he imagined was a British accent, speaking in an exaggerated, cartoonish voice that bore no resemblance to how any actual British person spoke. "Oh blimey, Governor," he said loudly. "Look at the fancy soldiers with their big fuzzy hats. Aren't they just marvelous?" The effect on the crowd was immediate and uncomfortable. British tourists looked genuinely offended by his mocking tone, while international visitors seemed embarrassed to be associated with such behavior. Children looked confused, unsure why the funny man was being so mean about something their parents had told them was special and important. But Marcus was just getting started. Having discovered that his fake accent was getting attention, he decided to expand his performance. "Or blimey, mate," he continued, now speaking even louder and in an even more exaggerated voice. "These here guards look proper posh, don't they? I reckon they'll be having tea and crumpets after this bit of marching about." What? Sarah grabbed his arm firmly. "Marcus, stop it. You're being incredibly rude." But her boyfriend was too caught up in his own show to listen to reason. He was performing now, playing to what he saw as his audience, completely oblivious to the fact that his audience was not entertained but rather disgusted by his behavior. The guards were close enough now that individual faces could be made out beneath their impressive bearskin hats. These were young men, most of them in their 20s, who had dedicated their lives to military service and the protection of their country's most important institutions. They had trained for months to earn the honor of participating in ceremonies like this one, and they took their responsibilities seriously. Marcus, however, saw only targets for his humor. "I bet they talk just like this all the time," he announced, continuing his offensive accent impression. "Cheerio, old chap, time to put on me silly hat and march about for the tourists, innit?" His voice had grown loud enough that tourists standing 20 feet away could hear every word clearly. The tension in the crowd was becoming palpable. Several British tourists had begun muttering among themselves, clearly discussing the rude American who was ruining their experience. A few seemed to be debating whether to say something directly to Marcus, while others appeared to be looking for security personnel who might be able to address the situation. Sarah could feel the hostile stares from all directions and realized that their fellow tourists were beginning to associate her with Marcus's behavior simply because she was standing next to him. She tried once more to get him to stop. "Marcus, please. Everyone is staring at us. You're being really offensive." But Marcus was in full performance mode now, feeding off what he interpreted as attention rather than recognizing it as disapproval. "Oh, I'm sorry," he said in his fake accent. this time directing his comments towards Sarah, but speaking loudly enough for the entire crowd to hear. Am I being too loud for the proper British folk? Perhaps they'd prefer I whisper about their silly little parade. The guards had now reached the point in their approach where they were close enough that the details of their uniforms and equipment were clearly visible. Their brass buttons gleamed in the gray London light. Their boots struck the pavement with military precision, and their bearing radiated the kind of discipline and professionalism that came from years of serious military training. Marcus chose this moment to escalate his performance even further. He began walking in what he thought was an imitation of the guard's march, taking exaggerated high steps and swinging his arms dramatically. "Look at me," he called out. "I'm a proper British soldier, I am. Marching about in me fancy red coat, protecting the Queen's corgis from dangerous tourists." The crowd's reaction was now uniformly negative. British tourists were openly glaring at him with expressions of disgust and anger. International visitors seemed embarrassed and uncomfortable, many of them stepping slightly away from Marcus as if to distance themselves from his behavior. Parents were covering their children's ears or trying to distract them from the increasingly offensive display. Sarah felt her face burning with embarrassment. She had known that Marcus could be arrogant and insensitive, but she had never seen him behave quite this badly in public. The combination of his fake accent, his mocking march, and his increasingly loud and offensive commentary was creating a scene that she knew would haunt her memory of their European vacation forever. The guards continued their professional approach, giving no indication that they could hear or were affected by Marcus's performance. This was part of their training. They were expected to maintain their composure and dignity regardless of how tourists behaved around them. They had dealt with countless inappropriate visitors over the years, and they knew that reacting would only make situations worse. But their professional composure seemed to frustrate Marcus rather than discourage him. He appeared to interpret their lack of reaction as a sign that he wasn't being entertaining enough, and he decided to increase the intensity of his performance accordingly. "Oi, oi, oi," he shouted, now adding what he thought were British expressions to his offensive accent. "Look sharp, lads. Time to impress the colonials with our fancy footwork." He had stopped any pretense of speaking quietly and was now clearly performing for the entire crowd, seemingly oblivious to the fact that his audience was not amused. Several tourists had begun taking videos of Marcus's performance, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. They were documenting his offensive behavior, perhaps planning to share it as an example of ugly American tourist stereotypes or to report it to palace security. The idea that his actions might have consequences beyond the immediate moment had clearly never occurred to him. The morning air was filled with the sound of military drums and the measured footsteps of the approaching guards, creating a backdrop of dignity and tradition that made Marcus's behavior seem even more jarring and inappropriate. The ceremony that he was mocking represented centuries of British culture and history, traditions that had been carefully preserved and passed down through generations. Marcus, however, remained completely focused on his own performance. "Right then, Governor," he continued in his exaggerated accent, "let's have ourselves a proper British parade, shall we? Mind the gap, and Bob's your uncle, or whatever it is you people say." His comments were becoming increasingly nonsensical as well as offensive, combining random British expressions he had heard in movies with his own ignorant assumptions about British culture. The guards had now reached the point where they were directly in front of the crowd, close enough that their individual faces were clearly visible. These were serious young men who had dedicated themselves to serving their country with honor and distinction. Their expressions remained professionally neutral, but there was something in their bearing that suggested they were very aware of everything happening around them. Marcus seemed to take their proximity as an invitation to escalate his performance even further. He stepped closer to the barriers that separated the tourists from the ceremonial area and began speaking even more loudly, as if he wanted to make absolutely sure the guards could hear every word of his mocking commentary. "Blimey, what have we here?" he announced, his fake accent reaching new levels of offensiveness. "A whole parade of 10 soldiers, all dressed up with nowhere to go. I wonder if they know any other tricks besides marching about looking serious." The crowd around him had grown completely silent except for Marcus's voice. Even children seemed to sense that something was wrong with the situation, though they might not have understood exactly what was happening. The contrast between the dignity of the ceremony and the crudeness of Marcus's behavior was becoming more stark with each passing moment. Sarah made one final attempt to control the situation. "Marcus, stop this right now," she hissed urgently. "You're embarrassing yourself and everyone around you. These people are trying to enjoy a cultural experience, and you're ruining it. But Marcus was too far into his performance to listen to reason. He had committed himself to this course of action and seemed determined to see it through to whatever conclusion awaited him. The attention he was receiving, even though it was entirely negative, appeared to be feeding his ego and encouraging him to continue his offensive display. "Don't worry, love," he said to Sarah in his fake accent. "I'm just having a bit of fun with our British friends here. Surely they can appreciate a good joke about their quaint little traditions." The condescending tone in his voice made his words even more insulting than they already were. The guards continued their ceremonial duties with professional precision, but something subtle in their bearing suggested that the situation was not going unnoticed by the appropriate authorities. Marcus, however, was too caught up in his own performance to notice these subtle signs or to consider that his behavior might have consequences beyond the immediate discomfort of his fellow tourists. As the ceremony continued to unfold around him, Marcus Thompson remained completely unaware that his morning of entertainment was about to take a very different turn. The stage was set for a confrontation that would teach him a lesson about respect, dignity, and the difference between confidence and arrogance. His moment of reckoning was approaching, and when it arrived, it would arrive with all the precision and professionalism that characterized everything about the guards he had spent the morning mocking. The gray London sky seemed to grow darker as the ceremony continued, as if the weather itself was reflecting the tension that Marcus's behavior had created among the crowd of international tourists. The drums continued to beat their steady rhythm, the guards continued their precise movements, and Marcus continued his offensive performance, completely unaware that everything was about to change. The ceremony reached its peak as the guards executed their intricate drill movements with military precision. Each step, each turn, each command was performed with the kind of flawless coordination that comes only from months of rigorous training and absolute dedication to excellence. The tourists watched in genuine awe as the guards demonstrated the discipline and skill that had made the British military legendary throughout history. Marcus, however, had reached new heights of offensive behavior. His fake accent had become increasingly crude and exaggerated, and he had begun adding physical gestures that were clearly intended to mock the guards' ceremonial movements. He strutted around in a ridiculous parody of military bearing, his arms swinging wildly as he attempted to imitate what he saw as the silly formality of British tradition. "Look at me, Sarah," he called out loudly. "I'm the Queen's special guard. I protect the royalty cakes from dangerous pigeons." He marched in an exaggerated circle, completely oblivious to the fact that every person within a 50-foot radius was staring at him with expressions ranging from embarrassment to outright disgust. The British tourists in the crowd had moved beyond mere disapproval to something approaching genuine anger. These were people who had grown up with deep respect for their military traditions, and the men and women who served their country with honor. Watching an arrogant foreign tourist mock something they held sacred was more than they could quietly tolerate. An elderly British gentleman wearing a regimental tie stepped forward from the crowd. His weathered face showed the kind of quiet dignity that comes from a lifetime of service and sacrifice. The medals pinned to his jacket indicated that he was a military veteran, someone who understood exactly what the ceremony represented and why it deserved respect. "Excuse me, young man," the veteran said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Your behavior is completely inappropriate. These men are serving soldiers, not performers for your entertainment." Marcus turned toward the elderly gentleman with a smirk that showed he had no intention of backing down. If anything, the direct confrontation seemed to energize him further. He had been playing to an unwilling audience, but now he had someone who was actually engaging with his performance. "Oh, look here," Marcus said in his fake accent. "One of the locals wants to have a chat with the rude American. How delightfully British of him." The mockery in his voice was unmistakable, and several people in the crowd gasped at his disrespectful response to the veteran's reasonable request. The elderly gentleman's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "I served in the British Army for 32 years, son. I've watched my friends die defending the freedom that allows you to stand here and make a fool of yourself. The least you could do is show some basic respect." Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm desperately, finally, understanding how serious the situation had become. "Marcus, please," she whispered urgently. "This man is a veteran. You need to apologize right now." But Marcus was too far into his performance to consider backing down. The confrontation with the veteran had given him a new target for his mockery. and he seemed to relish the opportunity to expand his offensive display. "Oh, military service," he said dismissively. "How impressive. I suppose that gives you the right to lecture tourists about how to behave, does it?" The crowd around them had grown completely silent except for Marcus's voice. Even young children seemed to sense that something serious and uncomfortable was happening. Parents pulled their children closer, while other tourists began slowly backing away from the confrontation that was clearly escalating beyond mere rudeness into something more serious. The veteran took a step closer to Marcus, his military bearing still evident despite his advanced age. "It gives me the right to recognize a spoiled brat when I see one," he said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than Marcus's shouting ever could. "And it gives me the responsibility to speak up when someone dishonors the service of good men." Marcus laughed loudly, a sound that carried no humor but plenty of arrogance. "Dishonor? You think I'm dishonoring someone by pointing out that this whole ceremony is nothing but an expensive tourist attraction? Come on, old man. This isn't the 1800s anymore. Nobody actually cares about kings and queens and fancy dress-up games." The effect of his words on the crowd was electric. British tourists began muttering angrily among themselves, while international visitors looked shocked at the level of cultural insensitivity they were witnessing. Several people had begun filming the confrontation with their phones, capturing Marcus's behavior for posterity. Sarah could feel the hostile energy radiating from every direction and realized that the situation was spiraling completely out of control. She had tried repeatedly to get Marcus to moderate his behavior, but he seemed determined to make the worst possible impression on everyone around him. "Marcus, we need to leave," she said urgently, tugging at his sleeve. "Right now? This has gone too far." But Marcus shook off her hand dismissively. He was fully committed to his confrontation with the veteran now, seemingly energized by the older man's military bearing and obvious disapproval. "No, Sarah, this is interesting," he said loudly. "I want to hear more about how I'm supposed to be impressed by a bunch of grown men playing dress-up." The veteran's eyes flashed with controlled anger, but his voice remained steady. "These men have sworn an oath to serve their country and their sovereign. They've trained for years to earn the honor of participating in ceremonies like this one. Some of them have served in combat zones around the world, risking their lives to protect people like you." Marcus rolled his eyes theatrically. "Oh, please, spare me the patriotic speech. This is 2023, not World War II. These guys are basically living museum pieces, putting on a show for tourists who don't know any better." The crowd's reaction to this comment was immediate and unanimous. British tourists began voicing their outrage openly, while others shook their heads in disgust at Marcus's continued insensitivity. The situation had moved far beyond mere cultural rudeness into something approaching genuine hostility. But Marcus seemed oblivious to the growing anger around him. If anything, the negative reaction appeared to be encouraging him to escalate his behavior even further. "Look around you," he said, gesturing broadly at the crowd. "Everyone's taking pictures, and videos like this is some kind of amazing spectacle. But it's just a bunch of guys in funny hats walking around. There's nothing special about it." The veteran's composure finally began to crack slightly. "Nothing special," he repeated, his voice rising slightly. "These traditions represent hundreds of years of British history. The men participating in this ceremony are carrying on traditions that their great-grandfathers died to preserve." Marcus laughed again, a sound that was becoming increasingly grating to everyone within earshot. "History, tradition, blah, blah, blah. That's just marketing to sell postcards and attract tourists. None of this stuff actually matters in the real world." At that moment, something significant happened that Marcus was too self-absorbed to notice. One of the guards participating in the ceremony, a tall young man with steel-gray eyes and an unmistakably professional bearing, had moved slightly out of formation. He was still maintaining his ceremonial position, but his attention was clearly focused on the disturbance Marcus was creating. Sarah noticed the guard's attention and felt a chill of genuine fear run down her spine. She realized that Marcus's behavior had attracted exactly the kind of official notice that could turn their vacation into a genuine nightmare. "Marcus," she said urgently, "one of the guards is watching us. We really need to stop this right now." But Marcus was too caught up in his confrontation with the veteran to pay attention to Sarah's warning. "Let him watch," he said dismissively. "Maybe he'll learn something about how ridiculous he looks in that outfit." The veteran followed Sarah's gaze and noticed the guard's attention as well. His expression immediately became more serious, and he took a step back from the confrontation. As a former military man himself, he recognized the signs of professional interest from someone in uniform, and he understood that the situation was about to escalate beyond civilian control. "Son," he said quietly to Marcus, "you need to stop talking right now. You've attracted official attention, and that's not going to end well for you." Marcus turned to look at the guard who was watching them, and for the first time since the confrontation began, he seemed to realize that his behavior might have consequences beyond embarrassing Sarah and offending tourists. The guard's expression was completely professional and neutral, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he was taking careful note of everything that was happening. For a brief moment, Marcus seemed to consider moderating his behavior. The guard's attention was clearly official rather than casual, and even someone as arrogant as Marcus could recognize that he was potentially in trouble with actual authorities rather than just offended tourists. But then his ego reasserted itself, and he made the decision that would transform an embarrassing incident into a genuine crisis. Instead of backing down or apologizing, Marcus decided to escalate the situation even further by directing his mockery directly at the guard who was watching him. "Oh, look," he said loudly, pointing directly at the guard. "I've got the attention of one of the tin soldiers. I wonder if he's going to arrest me for hurting his feelings about his silly hat." The effect of directly addressing the guard was immediate and dramatic. The crowd around Marcus drew back sharply, as if they had suddenly realized they were standing too close to someone who was about to experience serious consequences for their behavior. The veteran shook his head in disbelief and stepped well back from the confrontation. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm with both hands, genuinely frightened now by how far the situation had escalated. "Marcus, stop," she pleaded. "You're talking to a soldier. This isn't a game anymore." But Marcus was too far into his performance to recognize the danger he had created for himself. The guard's professional attention, rather than warning him to back down, seemed to energize him further. He had found a new target for his mockery, and he was determined to prove that he wasn't intimidated by British authority. "What's the matter, soldier boy?" Marcus continued, his fake accent reaching new levels of offensiveness. "Don't like hearing the truth about your little costume party? Maybe you should stick to marching around and leave the thinking to people who actually live in the real world." The guard continued to watch Marcus with professional interest, his expression giving no indication of his thoughts or intentions. This was clearly someone who had been trained to maintain composure under pressure, someone who understood the importance of protocol and proper procedures even when dealing with offensive civilians. The crowd around Marcus had grown completely silent now, sensing that they were about to witness something significant. British tourists watched with expressions that mixed satisfaction with apprehension, knowing that Marcus was about to face consequences for his behavior, but uncertain about what form those consequences might take. International tourists seemed genuinely frightened by the direction the confrontation was taking. Many of them had begun slowly moving away from Marcus, not wanting to be associated with whatever was about to happen to the loud American who had spent the morning insulting their hosts. Marcus, however, remained completely focused on his new target. The guard's professional composure seemed to frustrate him rather than warn him, and he interpreted the soldier's silence as weakness rather than strength. "What's wrong?" he taunted. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you're not allowed to talk when you're dressed up like a toy soldier." Sarah made one final desperate attempt to salvage the situation. "Marcus, please," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "I'm begging you to stop this right now. You're about to get us both in serious trouble." But Marcus was beyond reason now. The combination of audience attention, confrontation with authority, and his own unshakable belief in his superiority had created a perfect storm of arrogance and poor judgment. He had convinced himself that he was simply exposing the foolishness of British traditions, and he was determined to prove his point regardless of the consequences. The morning air was filled with tension as thick as the gray clouds overhead. The ceremony continued around them with military precision, but the real drama was unfolding in the crowd where Marcus Thompson was about to learn a lesson about the difference between confidence and arrogance, between cultural criticism and cultural cruelty, and between entertainment and humiliation. The stage was set for a confrontation that would strip away all of Marcus's pretensions and reveal the true character that lay beneath his expensive clothes and performative confidence. The guard he was taunting was about to demonstrate why the British military had earned respect around the world, and why the traditions Marcus was mocking had survived for centuries despite the mockery of countless foolish visitors. Marcus Thompson had spent his morning playing the role of the ugly American tourist, but He was about to discover that some roles come with consequences that extend far beyond the moment of performance. The gray London sky seemed to darken further as the inevitable confrontation approached, and the crowd held its collective breath, knowing that they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after the ceremony itself was forgotten. The moment that would change everything came, without warning or fanfare. The guard who had been watching Marcus stepped forward from his ceremonial position with movements that were both fluid and precise. His approach was completely professional, showing no emotion or haste, but there was something in his bearing that immediately commanded the attention of everyone in the crowd. Marcus, still caught up in his own performance, initially misread the guard's approach as validation of his behavior. He seemed to think that he had finally succeeded in provoking a reaction from the stoic British soldier, and he prepared to escalate his mockery even further. The smirk on his face showed that he believed he was about to score another point in what he saw as his comedic performance. Well, Marcus said loudly, his fake accent reaching new levels of offensiveness. Look what we have here. One of the Queen's finest has decided to join our little chat. Are you going to tell me off for not being properly impressed by your marching band routine? The guard stopped exactly 3 feet away from Marcus, maintaining perfect military posture. Up close, it was immediately apparent that this was no ceremonial figurehead or tourist attraction. This was a professional soldier in peak physical condition, someone whose bearing radiated competence, discipline, and quiet authority. His uniform was immaculate, his posture perfect, and his eyes held an intelligence that Marcus had completely failed to recognize. When the guard finally spoke, his voice was clear, precise, and carried the unmistakable accent of someone who had received the finest education Britain had to offer. But it wasn't just the accent that stopped Marcus cold. It was the content of what the guard said, and the way he said it. I couldn't help but notice your commentary on our ceremony, the guard said, his voice carrying easily over the now silent crowd. Your observations about British military traditions were quite illuminating, particularly your insights into the intellectual capacity of serving soldiers. Marcus's face went blank for a moment as he processed what he was hearing. The guard's accent was nothing like the cartoonish voice Marcus had been using to mock British speech. This was the voice of someone who had clearly been educated at the finest institutions, someone who spoke with the confidence and precision that comes from extensive education and training. But Marcus quickly recovered his composure, or at least tried to. Oh, great, he said, attempting to maintain his mocking tone. The toy soldier wants to have a conversation. How delightfully British. Are you going to invite me for tea and crumpets next? The guard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that Marcus had just made a serious tactical error. Actually, the guard said calmly, I thought you might be interested to know a bit more about the toy soldiers you've been entertaining yourself with this morning. The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something significant was about to happen. British tourists watched with expressions of anticipation, while international visitors seemed to realize that they were about to witness either a spectacular apology or a spectacular humiliation. Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm more tightly, finally, understanding that her boyfriend was facing someone who was far more formidable than he had realized. The guard continued speaking in the same measured, educated tone. The gentleman you see to my left, for instance, he said, gesturing toward another guard who maintained his ceremonial position, recently returned from a 6-month deployment in Afghanistan, where he served as a combat medic. He saved 17 lives during a particularly difficult operation under enemy fire. Marcus's confident smirk began to fade slightly as he realized that the conversation was not going in the direction he had expected. The guard's calm professionalism was far more intimidating than any angry response would have been. The soldier behind me, the guard continued, speaks 4 languages fluently and holds a degree in international relations from Oxford University. He joined the military after completing his education because he wanted to serve his country rather than simply profit from his advantages. The crowd was now completely silent except for the guard's voice. Even the sounds of the ongoing ceremony seemed muted in comparison to the quiet authority with which the soldier was speaking. Marcus found himself listening despite his desire to continue his mocking performance. As for myself, the guard said, his tone remaining conversational but carrying unmistakable authority, I hold advanced degrees from Cambridge University in both history and international law. I speak 6 languages, including Mandarin and Arabic. Before joining the military, I worked for the Foreign Office, and I've served in diplomatic missions in 12 countries. Marcus's face had gone pale, and his fake accent had completely disappeared. The reality of the situation was finally beginning to penetrate his arrogance. This wasn't some uneducated ceremonial figure he could mock without consequences. This was someone who was far more educated, experienced, and accomplished than Marcus himself. But the guard wasn't finished. "I noticed your particular interest in our accents," he continued, his voice carrying just a hint of steel beneath its cultured tone. "You seemed quite confident in your ability to imitate British speech patterns. I wondered if you might be interested in a small linguistic exercise." Sarah could feel the tension radiating from Marcus's body as he finally began to understand that he was facing someone who was completely out of his league. But it was too late to back down now. The entire crowd was watching, and Marcus's ego wouldn't allow him to admit that he had been wrong about everything. "What kind of exercise?" Marcus asked, his voice noticeably less confident than it had been moments before. The guard smiled slightly, an expression that somehow managed to be both polite and predatory. "Well, since you've demonstrated such expertise in British linguistics, perhaps you could tell us all about the regional variations in British accents. You seem to believe there's just one British accent, but surely someone as worldly as yourself understands the differences between, say, received pronunciation, Yorkshire dialects, Scottish Highlands speech patterns, and Welsh linguistic variations." Marcus opened and closed his mouth several times, clearly unable to formulate a response. His fake British accent had been based entirely on American movies and television shows, not on any actual knowledge of British culture or linguistics. The guard's question had exposed the complete ignorance that lay beneath his confident mockery. "No response," the guard asked politely. "That's quite surprising, given your earlier confidence in critiquing our speech patterns. Perhaps you'd like to tell us about the historical development of the accent you were so expertly imitating? Its relationship to Middle English, perhaps, or its evolution through the Norman conquest." The crowd began to murmur appreciatively as they realized what was happening. The guard wasn't just defending himself or his fellow soldiers. He was systematically dismantling Marcus's pretensions with the precision of a surgeon. Every question he asked revealed another layer of ignorance beneath Marcus's confident performance. Marcus looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the intellectual trap he had walked into. But the crowd that had been his unwilling audience for the morning's mockery was now completely focused on watching him face the consequences of his behavior. I was just having a bit of fun," Marcus stammered, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. "It was just a joke." The guard nodded thoughtfully. Humor. An interesting defense. Tell me, what exactly did you find amusing about our ceremony? The historical significance dating back to 1660? The military precision that requires months of training to achieve? The fact that many of these men have risked their lives defending the freedoms that allow you to stand here and mock them? Each question hit Marcus like a physical blow. The guard's tone remained completely conversational, but his words were stripping away every excuse and justification that Marcus might have offered for his behavior. "Perhaps," the guard continued, "you found it amusing that some of these soldiers are Rhodes Scholars, or that others have advanced degrees in engineering and medicine? Or maybe the humor lies in the fact that they've chosen to serve something larger than themselves rather than simply pursuing personal profit." Sarah watched in fascination and horror as her boyfriend, the confident, successful entrepreneur who had seemed so sure of himself throughout their European vacation, was systematically reduced to speechlessness by someone he had dismissed as a toy soldier in a funny hat. The guard took a step closer to Marcus, his bearing becoming slightly more intimidating without losing any of its professionalism. "You mentioned earlier that our traditions don't matter in the real world. I'm curious about your expertise in global affairs. Perhaps you could share your insights into the diplomatic importance of ceremonial traditions in international relations." Marcus shook his head mutely, clearly unable to formulate any kind of intelligent response to the guard's questions. "Or perhaps," the guard continued, "you'd like to discuss the economic impact of British military traditions on international tourism? The cultural significance of preserving historical ceremonies in an increasingly globalized world? The role of military discipline in maintaining democratic institutions?" Each question revealed another area of knowledge that Marcus clearly lacked, another aspect of the situation that he had never considered in his rush to mock what he didn't understand. The guard was demonstrating not just superior education and experience, but a depth of thinking that made Marcus's crude commentary look childish in comparison. "I notice you mentioned that this is 2023, not the Middle Ages," the guard said. "An interesting observation. Tell me, What do you know about the evolution of British military traditions from medieval times to the present? How they've adapted to changing social conditions while maintaining their essential character? Marcus could only stare at the guard in stunned silence. The man who had spent the morning confidently lecturing everyone about the irrelevance of British traditions was clearly unable to demonstrate even basic knowledge about the subjects he had been so eager to criticize. The guard's expression remained perfectly polite, but there was something in his eyes that suggested he was just getting started. You seem to have strong opinions about military service in general. I'd be interested to hear about your own experience with service to others. Perhaps you volunteered for humanitarian organizations, participated in disaster relief efforts, donated your time to helping those less fortunate than yourself. The questions kept coming, each one more devastating than the last. The guard was systematically exposing every aspect of Marcus's character that made his morning's performance so offensive: his ignorance, his selfishness, his complete lack of understanding about service and sacrifice. Sarah found herself watching the confrontation with a mixture of embarrassment and fascination. She was seeing a side of Marcus that she had never witnessed before, not just his capacity for rudeness, which she had known about, but his complete inability to back up his confident opinions with actual knowledge or experience. The crowd around them had grown larger as other tourists realized that something extraordinary was happening. Word was spreading that one of the guards was systematically dismantling the rude American who had spent the morning mocking their ceremony. People were taking videos, but now they were filming Marcus's humiliation rather than his offensive performance. The gray London morning had turned into something far more dramatic than anyone had expected when they arrived to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. Instead of a simple military ritual, they were witnessing an intellectual demolition that would be talked about for years to come. Marcus Thompson, the confident Silicon Valley entrepreneur who had started the day believing himself superior to everything British culture had to offer, now stood speechless before a soldier whose education, experience, and character far exceeded his own. The stage was set for an even more devastating revelation that would complete his transformation from confident critic to thoroughly humiliated fool. The guard studied Marcus's stunned expression with the calm patience of someone who had dealt with difficult situations in far more challenging circumstances than a London tourist attraction. The silence stretched for several long moments as Marcus struggled to formulate any kind of response to the intellectual challenge he was facing. Finally, the guard spoke again, his tone remaining conversational, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority. I can see that you're having difficulty with these questions. Perhaps we should approach this from a different angle. You mentioned that you're American, from Silicon Valley, if I heard correctly? Marcus nodded mutely, his earlier confidence completely gone. He seemed to have finally realized that he was facing someone who was operating on an entirely different intellectual level than he had anticipated. Fascinating, the guard continued. I spent 2 years working with the British Embassy in San Francisco, so I'm quite familiar with the area. Wonderful place, such an interesting blend of technological innovation and cultural diversity. Tell me, which university did you attend? Stanford? Berkeley? Perhaps UC San Francisco? Marcus's face flushed red as he realized the trap he was walking into. His educational background was respectable, but nowhere near as impressive as he had led people to believe throughout his life. He had attended a decent state university and earned a business degree through a combination of moderate intelligence and significant family financial support. San Jose State, Marcus mumbled, his voice barely audible to the crowd that was now hanging on every word of the exchange. The guard nodded politely. A fine institution. And your field of study? Business administration, Marcus replied, his voice growing even quieter as he realized how unimpressive his credentials sounded in comparison to the Oxford and Cambridge degrees the guard had mentioned. Excellent. Business is so important to modern society, the guard said with apparent sincerity. I imagine your work in Silicon Valley must be quite challenging. What kind of technology company do you run? Marcus's flush deepened as he realized he was about to be forced to reveal another aspect of his life that was far less impressive than his behavior had suggested. I develop mobile apps, he said reluctantly. How innovative, the guard responded. What kind of applications? Something in the medical field, perhaps? Educational technology? Software to help underserved communities? The questions kept coming, each one more pointed than the last. Marcus found himself forced to admit that his tech empire consisted primarily of simple games and utility apps designed to generate advertising revenue. Nothing groundbreaking, nothing that served any greater purpose than making money from people's casual phone usage. I see, the guard said thoughtfully. So your business model is essentially extracting profit from people's time and attention through advertising-supported entertainment. Fascinating. And you've built this into a significant enterprise, I assume? Marcus shifted uncomfortably, realizing that his company's modest success was going to sound even less impressive when stated plainly. We do okay, he said evasively. But the guard wasn't going to let him escape with vague answers. How many employees do you have? What's your annual revenue? I'm quite interested in successful technology entrepreneurship. Each question forced Marcus to reveal another aspect of his relatively modest achievements. His company employed only 12 people. His annual revenue, while comfortable, was nowhere near the millions he had implied through his behavior and spending. His Silicon Valley empire was revealed to be a small but profitable business that allowed him to live comfortably, but hardly made him the technology titan he pretended to be. The crowd listened with growing fascination as the guard systematically dismantled every aspect of Marcus's cultivated image. British tourists who had been offended by his earlier behavior now watched with satisfaction as he was forced to confront the reality of his own limitations. Sarah found herself learning things about Marcus that she had never known. Throughout their relationship, he had presented himself as a hugely successful entrepreneur, someone who was changing the world through technology innovation. Now she was discovering that his achievements, while respectable, were far more modest than he had led her to believe. The guard continued his methodical questioning. And your philanthropy? Surely someone as successful as yourself is involved in giving back to the community? Perhaps supporting education for underprivileged children, funding medical research, contributing to veterans organizations? Marcus's expression grew even more uncomfortable as he was forced to confront his complete lack of charitable giving or community service. His lifestyle was entirely focused on personal pleasure and consumption, with no consideration for helping others or contributing to causes larger than himself. I don't really have time for that kind of thing, Marcus admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. I see, the guard said, his tone remaining polite but somehow managing to convey volumes about his opinion of someone who claimed to be too busy for charity while having plenty of time for expensive European vacations and mocking foreign cultures. The contrast between Marcus and the guard was becoming more stark with each passing moment. Here was a soldier who had dedicated his life to serving others, who had earned advanced degrees from the world's finest universities, who spoke multiple languages, and had served his country in dangerous situations around the world. And he was facing an app developer who spent his time creating mobile games and his money on luxury travel, contributing nothing to society beyond entertainment for people looking to waste time on their phones. But the guard wasn't finished with his gentle but devastating interrogation. You mentioned earlier that our ceremony is just an expensive tourist attraction. I'm curious about your background in tourism and cultural economics. Have you studied the economic impact of cultural tourism on local communities? Marcus could only shake his head, finally, understanding that every topic the guard raised would expose another area of his ignorance. Because, the guard continued, the ceremonies you've been mocking this morning generate hundreds of millions of pounds in tourist revenue for Britain annually. They support thousands of jobs in the hospitality industry, from hotel workers to tour guides to restaurant staff. The cultural heritage you dismiss as outdated provides employment and economic opportunity for countless families. Each fact hit Marcus like a physical blow. Not only had he been mocking traditions he didn't understand, but he had been dismissing economic realities that affected real people's livelihoods. His casual arrogance was revealed to be not just ignorant, but actually harmful in its implications. The guard took another step closer, his bearing becoming slightly more intimidating without losing any of its professional composure. But perhaps most interesting to me is your confidence in criticizing traditions you clearly know nothing about. Tell me, when you were planning your European vacation, did you make any effort to learn about the cultures you were visiting? Did you read any books about British history? Study the significance of the ceremonies you planned to witness? Marcus's silence was answer enough. His approach to travel was purely consumptive. He went places to be entertained and to have experiences he could show off to others, not to learn or grow or understand different cultures. The idea of preparing for his trip by actually studying the places he was visiting had never occurred to him. I thought not, the guard said quietly. So you've spent your morning mocking traditions that represent centuries of British history, insulting men who have dedicated their lives to serving others, and demonstrating a level of cultural ignorance that would be embarrassing in a teenager. let alone a supposedly successful adult. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. The crowd was completely silent, sensing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the humiliation of a rude tourist, but a masterclass in how intelligence, education, and genuine accomplishment could be used to expose and defeat arrogance and ignorance. Marcus looked around desperately, seeking some escape from the intellectual trap he had walked into. But there was no escape. Every avenue the guard had explored had revealed another aspect of Marcus's inadequacy. His education, his business achievements, his cultural knowledge, his charitable contributions, his travel preparation. Every area of inquiry had exposed the shallow, selfish character that lay beneath his expensive clothes and confident facade. Sarah watched the confrontation with a mixture of embarrassment and revelation. She was seeing not just Marcus's humiliation, but the complete exposure of character flaws she had somehow failed to notice during their relationship. His treatment of the guard and the other tourists revealed a level of casual cruelty and cultural arrogance that shocked her. The veteran who had initially confronted Marcus watched the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. As someone who had dedicated his own life to service, he clearly appreciated seeing Marcus face consequences for his disrespectful behavior towards serving soldiers. Other British tourists in the crowd were recording the confrontation with their phones, capturing what would undoubtedly become a viral video showing the complete intellectual demolition of an arrogant American tourist. But they weren't recording it for entertainment. They were documenting a moment of justice, a demonstration that actions have consequences, and that ignorance and arrogance would eventually be exposed. The guard stepped back slightly, his expression returning to its original professional neutrality. But the damage to Marcus's ego and reputation was complete and irreversible. In the space of a few minutes, he had been transformed from a confident critic into a thoroughly exposed fraud. "I think," the guard said quietly, "that perhaps you owe some apologies to the veterans in this crowd who you've insulted with your casual dismissal of military service. To the British tourists whose culture and traditions you've mocked without bothering to understand them. To your girlfriend, who has clearly been embarrassed by your behavior. And to the soldiers you've spent the morning treating as objects of amusement rather than human beings deserving of basic respect." Marcus stood frozen in place, his face pale and his confidence completely shattered. The moment of reckoning had arrived, and he was finally forced to confront the reality of his own character and behavior. The gray London morning had become the stage for his complete humiliation, and there was nowhere left to hide from the consequences of his arrogance and ignorance. The crowd waited in silent anticipation to see how Marcus would respond to this devastating intellectual and moral defeat. Would he find the courage to apologize and admit his mistakes, or would his ego prevent him from acknowledging the truth that had been so comprehensively exposed? The answer would determine whether this morning would mark the beginning of personal growth or simply the completion of his humiliation. The silence that followed the guard's final words seemed to stretch for an eternity. Marcus stood frozen in place, his face cycling through emotions as the full weight of his humiliation settled upon him. The confident entrepreneur who had started the morning believing himself superior to British culture and traditions now found himself exposed as an ignorant, arrogant fool in front of hundreds of witnesses. For several long moments, it seemed as though Marcus might attempt to salvage some dignity by offering the apologies the guard had suggested. His mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words that might begin to repair the damage his behavior had caused. But his ego, which had gotten him into this situation, seemed determined to prevent him from finding a graceful way out. Instead of apologizing, Marcus made one final, desperate attempt to assert his superiority. "Look," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I don't care how many degrees you have or how many languages you speak. This is still just a tourist show, and you're still just guys in costumes marching around for people's entertainment." The effect of his words on the crowd was immediate and devastating. Whatever sympathy anyone might have felt for his embarrassing situation evaporated instantly. British tourists looked genuinely angry, while international visitors seemed shocked that anyone could be so persistently obtuse in the face of such comprehensive correction. The guard's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested that Marcus had just made the worst possible choice. "I see," he said quietly. "You've chosen to double down on ignorance rather than learn from this experience. That's unfortunate." What happened next would be talked about for months in tourist circles and social media. The guard reached into his uniform jacket and withdrew what appeared to be a small leather folder. He opened it carefully and displayed its contents to Marcus, whose face went from pale to absolutely white in the space of a few seconds. "Perhaps," the guard said conversationally, "you'd be interested to know that in addition to my military duties, I also work part-time for the Metropolitan Police as a liaison for tourist-related incidents. And what you've been doing this morning, harassing military personnel, disturbing the peace, and creating a public nuisance, are all actionable offenses under British law." Marcus stared at the police identification in complete shock. Not only had he been intellectually demolished by someone far more educated and accomplished than himself, but he had been doing it in front of a law enforcement officer who had been documenting his behavior the entire time. "Now," the guard continued, his voice taking on a slightly more official tone, "normally, I might be inclined to let something like this pass with a warning, especially for a tourist who might not understand our customs. But your persistent refusal to show any respect or remorse suggests that perhaps a more formal approach would be appropriate." Sarah grabbed Marcus's arm urgently. "Marcus, apologize," she whispered desperately. "Right now? Apologize to everyone, and maybe this doesn't get worse." For the first time since the confrontation began, Marcus seemed to truly understand the gravity of his situation. He wasn't just facing social embarrassment anymore. He was potentially looking at legal consequences that could ruin their vacation and follow him home to California. I'm sorry," Marcus stammered, his voice barely audible. I didn't mean." But the guard held up a hand to stop him. "I'm afraid that's not quite adequate, Mr. Thompson." The use of Marcus's name, which the guard had somehow learned during the confrontation, sent another chill through the crowd. "You see, your behavior this morning has been witnessed by hundreds of people, many of whom have been recording your performance. Your mockery of British military traditions, your harassment of serving soldiers, and your general disruption of a public ceremony have all been thoroughly documented." The guard gestured toward the crowd, where dozens of phones were still recording the ongoing confrontation. "These videos will undoubtedly be shared widely on social media, where they'll serve as a permanent record of your behavior. Your name, your company, your entire reputation will be forever associated with this morning's display of ignorance and arrogance." Marcus looked around at the crowd with growing horror, finally, understanding that his morning's entertainment had become a public relations nightmare that would follow him for the rest of his life. The videos being taken weren't just capturing his humiliation. They were creating a permanent record that would be available to his business partners, potential clients, and anyone else who might search for his name online. The veteran who had initially confronted Marcus stepped forward again. "Young man," he said firmly, "I've served my country for over 3 decades, and I've seen many difficult situations. But I've rarely encountered someone as determinately disrespectful as you've been this morning. The least you can do now is offer a proper apology to these soldiers and everyone else you've offended." Sarah could feel the weight of hundreds of stares focused on Marcus, waiting to see if he would finally find the courage to acknowledge his mistakes properly. The morning that had started with his confident mockery of British traditions was ending with him facing the very real possibility of legal action and permanent damage to his reputation. I apologize," Marcus said more loudly, his voice shaking with emotion. "I was wrong to mock your ceremony and your traditions. I was ignorant and disrespectful, and I'm sorry." The guard studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating the sincerity of his apology. "That's a start," he said finally. "But I think a more comprehensive acknowledgement might be appropriate. Perhaps you could tell everyone here what you've learned from this experience." Marcus swallowed hard, realizing that his humiliation was going to continue until he fully acknowledged every aspect of his wrongdoing. I learned that I was completely ignorant about British military traditions and culture. I made assumptions based on stereotypes instead of trying to understand the real significance of what I was seeing. I was disrespectful to people who have dedicated their lives to serving others, and I behaved like an ugly American tourist stereotype. The crowd listened to his confession with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. It was clear that Marcus was finally understanding the magnitude of his mistakes, but it was also obvious that his education had come at tremendous personal cost. The guard nodded approvingly. "And what about your behavior toward the tourists around you? Your disruption of their experience?" "I ruined their morning," Marcus admitted, his voice growing stronger as he continued his confession. "People came here to experience something meaningful, and I turned it into a spectacle about my own ignorance and arrogance. I'm sorry to everyone who had to witness my behavior." Sarah felt a mixture of relief and sadness as she watched Marcus finally take responsibility for his actions. Relief that he was finally showing some humility and understanding, but sadness that it had taken such a devastating public humiliation to bring out any decent behavior from the man she had been dating. The guard considered Marcus's words carefully. "Mr. Thompson," he said finally, "I'm going to make a decision that I hope you'll prove worthy of. Instead of filing formal charges for disturbing the peace and harassing military personnel, I'm going to treat this as a learning experience. But there will be conditions." Marcus nodded eagerly, desperate for any opportunity to avoid legal consequences. "First," the guard continued, "you will write a formal letter of apology to the British Embassy in Washington, acknowledging your behavior and expressing your commitment to better understanding other cultures in the future. Second, you will make a donation of £1,000 to the Veterans Association in honor of the soldiers you've insulted today. Third, you will spend the remainder of your time in Britain learning about our history and culture instead of just consuming it as entertainment." The conditions were both generous and appropriate. Marcus was being given a chance to transform his humiliation into genuine growth, to turn his ignorance into education. But the requirements also ensured that his learning would come at real personal cost and effort. "Do you accept these conditions?" the guard asked formally. "Yes," Marcus said immediately. "Yes, absolutely. Thank you for not making this worse than it had to be." The guard nodded and stepped back into his ceremonial position, his brief transformation from soldier to teacher now complete. The ceremony continued around them with the same precision and dignity it had maintained throughout Marcus's disruption, but the atmosphere in the crowd had changed completely. British tourists who had been angry now looked satisfied that justice had been served appropriately. International visitors seemed relieved that the ugly confrontation had been resolved without escalating into something more serious. Children who had been confused by Marcus's behavior now watched the ceremony with renewed interest, perhaps understanding better why the adults around them had reacted so strongly to his disrespect. Sarah took Marcus's arm and gently led him away from the crowd, understanding that they needed to remove themselves from the situation before anything else could go wrong. As they walked away from the palace, she could hear conversations starting up behind them as people began discussing what they had just witnessed. "That was incredible," she heard one British tourist say. "I've never seen anyone handled quite like that. Did you see how he just completely dismantled that arrogant American?" Another voice added. "Showed him exactly who he was dealing with. I felt sorry for the girlfriend," a third voice observed. "She seemed mortified by his behavior." The conversations faded as Marcus and Sarah moved further away from the crowd, but the weight of the morning's events hung heavy between them. They walked in silence for several blocks, both processing what had just happened and what it meant for their relationship and their remaining time in Europe. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Marcus looked at her with eyes that still showed the shock of his comprehensive defeat. "What? Is this who you really are?" she asked quietly. "Is this arrogant, disrespectful person I saw this morning the real Marcus Thompson? Or was this just some kind of aberration brought on by travel stress or cultural confusion?" Marcus was quiet for a long time as they continued walking through the gray London streets. When he finally answered, his voice was subdued and thoughtful in a way Sarah had rarely heard before. "I think," he said slowly, "that this morning showed me some things about myself that I didn't want to acknowledge. I've been so focused on being successful and confident that I forgot about being respectful and humble. That guard was everything I thought I was, but actually wasn't: educated, accomplished, worldly, but also decent and honorable." Sarah nodded, feeling both hope for Marcus's potential growth and sadness about what his behavior revealed about their relationship. "What are you going to do about it?" "I'm going to start by following through on those conditions exactly as promised," Marcus said firmly. "The letter, the donation, the cultural education, all of it. And then I'm going to spend some time thinking about what kind of person I want to be when I grow up." The gray London sky seemed to be clearing slightly as they walked, as if the weather was responding to Marcus's newfound humility. The morning that had begun with his confident mockery of British traditions was ending with a hard-earned lesson about respect, cultural sensitivity, and the difference between true confidence and mere arrogance. Marcus Thompson had learned that morning that real strength comes not from mocking others, but from understanding them, not from asserting superiority, but from demonstrating competence, and not from demanding respect, but from earning it through service and humility. It was a lesson that would serve him well in all his future travels, both literal and metaphorical. The changing of the guard ceremony continued behind them with its centuries-old precision and dignity, just as it had before Marcus's disruption, and just as it would long after his humiliation was forgotten. But, for one arrogant American tourist, that gray London morning had marked the beginning of a very different kind of change, a personal transformation that was long overdue and desperately needed.